time, and I call the honourable member for Indi.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Unlike my colleague on the other side, I will not be supporting this amendment. And primarily, I will not be supporting this amendment as I believe it fails the principal test of good legislation. It fails the test of equality, the principle of treating everybody equally. It's poor legislation because it discriminates, and it seems to be hugely unfair. It is poor legislation because it is almost impossible to implement. It fails the test of being righteous legislation. It's legislation based on fear and punishment. Its focus is to create a deterrent and a punishment for third parties without a balance of reward, rehabilitation or any long-term humanitarian approach. And secondly, my reasons for not supporting this legislation, and no more less of a priority, is because the overwhelming sentiment in my community and in my electorate is that I do this. In my professional judgment, I do not believe this legislation will be for the long-term benefit of the people of Australia. I have listened to my electorate, I have engaged with professionals in this area, and I'd particularly like to acknowledge the advisers from the Prime Minister's office for their briefing. I've read extensively on the topic, I've consulted widely, and I've turned to my conscience. And to the Minister in particular, responsible for immigration, I just need to say to him that I am making my own decision on this matter. I do not believe this legislation will be of long-term benefit for the people of Australia. And I say to the Minister, it's not because of the Greens, it's not because of Labor, it's because the people in my electorate and I think it's bad legislation. But in reference to the Minister, I acknowledge that our governments and previous ministers have had no easy task to address the flow of people seeking asylum in Australia. I acknowledge that they have worked hard, this government and previous governments, to address this issue. I acknowledge that the boats have stopped, that the children are out of custody, and that many refugees are being settled in Australia. But I also acknowledge that this has been done at great cost in money, in trust, in relationships and in reputational damage. And I believe we can do better, I believe we should do better, and I believe that we as a nation are better. And over the past 2 weeks, the people in my electorate have inundated my office with calls and correspondence against this particular amendment. And tonight I am here proudly to represent their views in this place. My community tell me that they, the people of Indi, believe that Australia can do better than this. That over 100 people have directly contacted my office with their concerns about the proposed amendment. One local Indi business owner sums up the sentiment of my electorate concisely. In short, I find this policy appalling. We are a better society than this, and I cannot believe that this policy will succeed. The people in my electorate tell me that the ends do not justify the means. And I just have heard from the member for Fairfax, all he could do was say, we need to be cruel, we need to be unkind, we need to be unjust, we need to punish a third party, because that's all we can do to solve this other problem. That basically is telling us that the ends justify the means. And there would be no person in this parliament, I think, who could actually stand up and say they believe that. We are a country that's clever enough to have good means to justify good ends. The people in my electorate are saying to me, Cathy, remember that the standard that you walk past is the standard you accept. The standard that we walk past in this instance is a standard of unjust behaviour. It's cruel behaviour, it punishes a third party, and I don't believe it's going to solve the problem. And in walking past it, in accepting it, in passing this legislation, that becomes the standard that we as a parliament aspire to. And one other member of my constituency told me, Cathy, She said, Michelle Obama, she had it right. She said, why don't we as a nation, when they aim low, we aim high? Why as a nation can't we do that? Why can't we be our best selves in this situation? Why do we seek to work at the bottom common denominator of punishment, of hurt, of cruelty? So together with the independent member for it works. Yeah, murdering people works.
Order. The member for Indi has the call.
Thanks very much. So I acknowledge the comments from the government. It's true it works. And as I say, at what cost? And does the end justify the means? So together with independent member for Denison, Andrew Wilkie, I am moving an amendment to this legislation. And we are calling on the government to drop its plan to ban asylum seekers from ever coming to Australia and instead develop a sophisticated response that deals with the situation in source countries, transit countries and countries of first asylum. Because I believe we can do better. I believe we as a nation are better than this. We are an innovative nation, we are creative, we are clever and we are a just nation. But in this amendment, I see no evidence of policy which is creative, innovative or just. And the major parties have a dogged focus on breaking the people smugglers' business model. And this provides very little room for public discourse about the bigger picture, about a better approach. Clearly, it's not satisfactory to have thousands of asylum seekers remain in Indonesia, desperate for an unlikely opportunity to come to Australia. And as long as they stay in Indonesia, they will continue to look to Australia as their final destination, and even as this government remains resolute that they should have no chance of doing so. How are we keeping these people connected with their home countries, or at least with the countries of their initial sanctuary, aiming to provide the opportunity for a safe return or resettlement? The minister says this policy is not based on fear, but on sending a message to the people smugglers. I disagree with him. All we see from the government are increasingly harsher laws that are against people seeking protection. We are getting crueler and crueler and crueler. And I ask, what is the government doing to target the people smugglers directly, instead of targeting asylum seekers by proxy? I call on the government to outline a plan for migration policy to this country. How can we bring more compassion into government policy without encouraging the false hope peddled by those who prey on the vulnerable and the desperate? I'm not naive about the problem. It's real, and we need to act. But I don't believe this is the best solution. Australia has a long history of accepting refugees for resettlement, and over 800,000 refugees and displaced people have settled in Australia since 1945, and many of them have come to my community. Many of them have settled happily and become prosperous people, part of my electorate. But I think the government is so focused on the people smugglers' marketing tactics, it's forgotten to talk to Australians about maintaining this country's reputation of welcoming refugees at their time of greatest need. And I call on the Prime Minister to share this government's long-term plan for migration policy, a plan that I believe that he has to have been thinking about, that's innovative, that it's creative, that will be effective, that will be just, that will be compassionate and will be effective. The government's migration policy has to have an impact. The minister notes how it has had an impact. The minister notes how it stopped the flow of boats to Australia. And since 2013, they've managed to close 17 detention centres, and they have removed children from detention. This is all admirable. The minister hopes that these new laws will mean the government can cut deals to empty the offshore detention centres. But the question they have not answered is what happens next. I support the government providing no room for equivocation or doubt about our country's migration policy position. However, it's incumbent on the government to show leadership and take a stronger role in the region to find a resolution compatible with Australian values. The global refugee crisis is both a humanitarian challenge and a border security problem. With an estimated 65 million displaced people worldwide, the problem is too large for Australia to tackle on its own. But equally, we cannot ignore our international responsibilities. Any response that will require a genuine regional solution involving most, if not all, Southeast Asian countries will include Australia and New Zealand. And I know we are working in this area. We just need to do more. Any solution must involve the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Australia's response to asylum seekers needs to be consistent with all of our international treaty obligations, including the Refugee Convention, the Rome Statute, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Mr Deputy Speaker, I believe we can do better. I believe we as a nation are better. My community believes we are better. I so want us to be better. And in bringing my speech to a conclusion, I'd like to quote from a famous internationalist, Pope Francis. And he says, "Frightened citizens build walls on one side and exclude people on the other." And Pope Francis says the best antidote to fear is mercy. Mercy and courage are needed to respond to the huge wave of refugee migrants and displaced people all over the world. Mercy and courage. And I agree with him. Oh, to be in a parliament where mercy, courage and justice were the hallmarks, not punishment and fear.